Hello and welcome to the Japan Archives, a podcast where we'll be delving into the histories and mythologies from Japan's long history. I'm your host, Thomas.
And I'm your co-host, Heather. We'll also be reading a poem for you every week and giving a little history about the poet who wrote it. Ikimashou!
Hello everyone, welcome back to the Japan Archives, episode 42 now, and yes, finally, we're going to talk about the man who saved Japan's cherry blossoms. It took a while to get here, but we're finally here. So Heather, how are you doing?
Rolling along pretty okay. I feel like I'm going to default to the weather, so I'm going to try to think of something different this time. Now, it was a beautiful day yesterday, so I took a nice walk. How are you?
I mean, that's technically still a kind of weather report, but okay, sure.
I know I've tried so hard and I still failed. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. First week of using the online system while school's out, and no longer using it. So I'm now just sat at home again, waiting for school to start at the beginning of June.
You can talk about the weather if you want, if that helps.
Nah, let's just dive into the episode, shall we?
Absolutely. I'm so excited for the cherry blossoms. Finally, we get to see them.
So in ancient Japan, as we know, blossoms were a symbol of new life and new beginnings. But this began to change, though, sadly, in the second half of the 19th century, and it did accelerate dramatically in the 1930s. Sadly, the cherry blossoms became more of a symbol of death than a symbol of longevity, new life, rebirth, and things. And this was a lot due, in fact, to the propaganda that was being made around the time and the fact that the Japanese people were not one for really questioning what they were told by the government. They just went along and believed it. As they were pushing this propaganda for a new view of cherry blossoms, we also find that classical poems as well had begun to become misinterpreted, to change their meanings, to also change how the Japanese people saw them. And eventually it became the norm that the Japanese spirit changed and involved the willingness to die now for the emperor, much like the cherry blossoms who had a brief and quick life every year. And so, slowly over time, we see that the government tried to replace the existing sakura around Tokyo and around Japan with a new breed known as the Somei Yoshino, due to the fact that they were easy to grow, easy to cultivate. On the whole, their cherry blossoms did survive for a lot short of a period to get the idea across of this idea of death that they wanted to portray. And one man eventually saw what was happening. He saw that the blossoms around Japan were being lost, and so he set out to ensure they survived for a new generation. Over his time, we'll see that he would discover new species, some, funnily enough, in his own backyard, but sadly already extinct in Japan. And he would even choose new names for the breeds that he came across, such as Hokusai, as well as Asano. And we'll also find out that he would be the first person to artificially hybridize the cherry blossoms from Japan. But of course, this is all part of the tale for later, so I want to go back and start at the very beginning. So today's episode, we're going to start by talking about the man known as Collingwood Ingram, a man who would later be known as Cherry Ingram, or just Cherry-san, and he was a wealthy grandson of the founder of the Illustrated London News. Born on October 30th, 1880, he was unfortunately quite a sickly child with many respiratory problems, and so when his family was in London, he didn't really get out much at the time. The city was still filled with disease and smoke, especially from all the coal that they burnt in the city. Weirdly enough, as he grew up, his family cared for a lot of albino birds when he was young, birds that they often took with them as they moved from their London home to the countryside, but also that they took with them on holidays. And being brought up around these birds and being able to wander around the countryside as he didn't go to school due to his illness, it ensured that Collingwood, by the age of 11, could already distinguish the sounds of most birds And by the age of 15, he had even written his first unpublished book on birds with illustrations in his own hand. And this would start an ongoing fascination for him with birds for many years to come, and lead him to actually becoming an ornithologist. Now, Collingwood's fascination with Japan probably began around the 1890s. However, as to specifically why this came about, we can't be too sure. At the time, he would have had access to several books on Japan. And as well, his family did have a rather large collection of dogs, which were known as the Chin variety, which were a Japanese breed, which could have played a part in his interest in Japan. Additionally, we find that he could have been exposed to the culture of Japan, though perhaps a comically, if not derogatory fashion through plays which had started to come to England at the time from Japan, as this was the time in which Japan was finally opening their borders after the decades of being a closed nation. Such shows he could have seen included the Mikado and the Geisha. But whatever cultivated Collingwood into being fascinated with this country only made him want to visit there himself. And so when he finally reached adulthood, and he could make decisions for himself, he decided it was finally time to go to this country that called him. And he arrived in Japan for the first time the 5th of September 1902 in the port of Nagasaki after taking a long journey there by boat. So his first time in Japan, I think it was safe to say that he was in awe of the beauty in the country he'd come across. This was a time just before they started their rapid industrialization and their modernization. And while he was there, he wrote many things about the country and said many others. One of them says that he found Japan to be very becoming, with tidy checks of paddy fields, bamboo groves, little villages, and usually a clear, swift running stream. So it kind of paints quite an idyllic view of an traditional and old Japan. Now, I personally would have thought that if you wanted to come to this country so desperately and to explore it, then you would have wanted to stay for quite a long time. However, his first visit, he only remained for 15 days. And during his time here, he did try and cram a lot in. He visited Kyoto, he went to Tokyo, he went to Hakone, as well as the island of Enoshima, which is close to Tokyo. And funnily enough, when he was on the island of Enoshima, a local priest gave him a tour. Collingwood at the time did not know any Japanese, and so it said that he politely nodded along to everything the priest said to him that day. And so, as he finally left Japan after his quick visit, he said, "My visit to Japan has been so enchanting that I have had no time to do else than stand agape and watch the different vistas pass away, without record in my journal. But a brief fortnight has left me with more memory pictures than months of travel elsewhere." And that was it for his first time visiting Japan, and it wouldn't be for another 5 years until he finally returned here once more. We're gonna jump to his next visit to Japan. He came back on the 20th of April 1907. And this time he brought along another person with him. He brought along his wife Florence. And though at this time he still had yet to gain an interest in the cherry blossoms of Japan, he actually came in the hopes of being the first British person to find eggs of a bird known as the white thrush. And he also wanted to be the first British person to then bring these eggs home with him. In Tokyo, he applied for the paperwork to be able to search and hunt for these animals, but with Japan being Japan, it did take 3 weeks for the paperwork to be finished. And then he went on a walking tour on the slopes of Mount Fuji immediately afterwards. Eventually, almost luckily, as it appears these birds were quite hard to find, and with the additional help of the local people, a nest was found bearing eggs of the white thrush. And when he returned home again to England, his expedition had found him actually leaving with 74 different kinds of birds, numerous different bird eggs, as well as many writings and illustrations he had done during his expedition. Soon after that, we find that World War I comes around, and he finds himself in France, where he did continue to do his study of birds in his time there. But after the war, he did find himself in need of trying to get back to a normal life. after he'd finished in the military. And he also came to the realization that there was nothing new in the world of ornithology for him, and so he was desperately seeking a new hobby. And this is when we see him finally turning his attention to the plant world. In 1919, he and his wife moved to Kent for a fresh start. The home had a dilapidated garden at the time that Collingwood was wanting to spruce up, and he found this was going to be the perfect project for someone who needed to be a hobby. And that is when he discovered his garden had a little secret that he hadn't noticed at first. And this was the fact that there were 2 ornamental cherry trees in his backyard.
So there were cherry trees already in his garden. Where did they come from?
So I'm not exactly too sure where these original blossoms would have come from. I mean, presumably, historically, they are descended from cherry trees which were from Japan, but whether these ones were specific cuttings or seedlings that came from Japan, or whether they were cuttings from another tree that was already in England, I'm not too sure. But I do know that when, like I said, when he moved in, the house held these trees as a little secret for him, because at first he didn't realize what they were. He just thought he had some trees in his garden. And it wasn't until the spring, when the cherry blossoms finally bloomed, that he realized the beauty of the trees that he actually had in his garden. And he finally realized, oh, I have some cherry trees.
Oh, thank you.
It's okay. And so, like I said, he finally saw these cherry blossoms blooming. And that's when he kind of knew what he now wanted to do. Not only did he want to become a foremost expert on cherry blossoms now, but he also wanted to be the man to try and collect as many different cherry tree varieties as possible and have it become the largest collection of such trees in the world. So at this point in time, he still hasn't realized that he wants to save the cherry blossoms of Japan. Right now, it's just he's found his new hobby and he's found something he wants to try and become an expert in, which I suppose did turn out well in the end for Japan. But to be an expert, he obviously needed somewhere to start. He needed to start his research into cherry blossoms. And at the time, there were not that many books on Japan. He could have had access to books such as Things Japanese, which is a book from 1890 and was a dictionary about Japanese culture. There was the Flora Japonica from 1835 by Philip von Siebold, and there was also other books such as Bushido, The Soul of Japan from 1900. So he could have got a basic idea of Japanese culture at the time, as well as some idea about the flora of Japan, but still not as many books as he would have ideally wanted to start his research. And so we jump forward to 1925. So this is a mere 6 years now after he's moved into his Kent house. And we already see that over these 6 years, he has done as much research as he could possibly do in this time. And he has become quite an expert on cherry trees. And he even now boasts a collection of 70 different cherry tree varieties in his garden. So quite a commendable achievement in only the span of 6 years. In 1925 also, we find something called Notes on Japanese Cherries, which was written by him and published in the Royal Horticultural Journal, which was a great achievement for him at the time. But the more trees he sought and the more trees he bought, the more he found himself buying trees that were actually of the same variety. He was beginning to see that a lot of cherry trees at this time had not yet properly been classified, and additionally, English sellers who had got their hands on cuttings and who had got their hands on cherry tree seeds, they were giving them their own English names to increase their appeal, such as apple blossom, due to like cherries having like a pale greenish blossom to them. Whereas he could find one seller which would call a specific species apple blossom, a different English seller could have the same type of tree, but he could have chosen a different poetic name that they thought would cause it to sell well. And so more and more, Collingwood was now seeing that he was buying the same trees over and over again. But of course, he couldn't always be too sure because of the naming characteristics, whether he had this tree or not. And so he was still buying all these trees just in case there were new varieties that he could get hold of at the time. But over time, he realized more and more and more he was just getting more of the same types of trees. And so he asked for the help of 2 Japanese cherry experts. The one man called Manabu Miyoshi from Tokyo Imperial University and another man called Genichi Koizumi from Kyoto University. He knew that they would be better suited in helping him figure out if trees he had were the same, as well as identifying trees that he had but didn't yet know the true name of. And one of these such trees was, funnily enough, the tree that had always been in his garden from the start. Those two cherry trees that had always been there, he didn't know the name of the tree, he didn't know what type the tree was, and so he sent leaf samples of this tree to Miyoshi, only to find out that this tree didn't actually have a name. Apparently, it was a species either never recorded before, at least in Japan, or one that maybe had been recorded but had been forgotten. And so Collingwood decided to name this species himself, and he dubbed this species Hokusai. And I promise that is an unintentional callback to last episode. After more research after this, he finally settled on something about the cherry blossoms of Japan. From what he could tell as of right now, there were originally 10 different wild species of cherry blossoms in Japan, but through the years of human interaction, the selective breeding, and things like that, he now believed that there were more than 400 different varieties of cherries in the world, or even just in Japan. And so he continued into his research. Obviously, if there was 400 varieties, he had a lot of work cut out to do if he wanted to collect them all. And he continued to expand his collection, and so he found himself going farther and wider in the search for cherry trees. He began contacting friends to send or swap saplings with him if they had cherry trees in their gardens. Additionally, at the time, the Yokohama nursery had opened in 1907, and so he found it easier to start importing cherry trees from Japan if they were in their catalogue of trees to buy. And not to forget, there was the big botanical gardens of Kew in London, which houses a big range of flowers and trees, which he relied on as well for his collection, as he was fortunate enough to have a friend who also worked there, making it a little easier to get hold of some of the samples. And other trees as well came from other places. They came even from America through links to people who had connections to the New York Botanical Gardens. And so Collingwood had obviously gained connections around the world that he could draw upon to try and bring together all of the cherry trees in existence. But we find that now in the early 20s, he was getting to a point where he couldn't really get hold of any more cherries, at least from where he was in England. And so he knew it was finally time to return to Japan, to find varieties not only unimportable to England, but also trees that were perhaps not yet known or discovered in the various temples, shrines, and even mountainsides of Japan. And so that's exactly what he did. He decided he would again return to Japan. In a lucky turn of events, around this same time that he wanted to return, his garden was visited in 1924 by Duke Takasumasa. Now, this duke had connections to the imperial family and actually knew Ingram through a man known as Isai Iijima, a man who all those years ago had helped Collingwood with his permits when he went to collect the eggs the second time in Japan. So through a lucky system of connections, he knew of the Duke, and the Duke said that he would help him get back to Japan. And so Collingwood drew up a list of 4 places that he wanted to definitely go during his time in Japan to try and find as many different cherry trees as he could. The first was he wanted to visit the temples and shrines in Kyoto. The second was that he wanted to visit Tokyo. Third, he wanted to venture up into the foothills of Mount Fuji. And lastly, he wanted to visit the small city of Nikko, north of Tokyo. And so finally, we see him heading to Japan once again in 1926. This sadly would be his final visit to Japan. He wouldn't find himself going there ever again. During his time there, he would collect many new specimens for his collection. He would even meet with cherry blossom experts. But on his return, we will see that the country did not take his breath away as it had once done. The industrialization of Japan had changed the entire country in his mind. Ingram wrote that while he was there, it appears that the commercialization of Japan has caused the cult of these beautiful trees to wane. Cherry gardens, which had been cultivated now for years by the shoguns, had been left abandoned, forgotten, or even torn down. And so the cherry trees were now disappearing. At least the old breeds, it appeared to Collingwood, were disappearing. Collingwood knew that some would still hang on in the mountains, but the want to care for these blossoms had now mostly gone from the looks of it, and the government was now looking for a symbol of unity. And the easy to grow and maintain Somei Yoshino variety that I mentioned at the start of the episode was looking more and more appealing to the government. They wanted something easy. They wanted something that was still a symbol of Japan. And using this tree would mean they didn't have to put as much work and effort into caring for the old breeds like the shoguns and the people in general had done for centuries by this point. Collingwood even realized quickly, after arriving in Japan, that 4 different varieties that were in his garden could no longer be found in Japan. They had already gone extinct in the country. And he found this almost unbelievable in a way. This was Japan. This was supposed to be the country that venerated the cherry blossoms to such high esteem. They were supposed to care for a cherry blossom no matter its type, no matter how difficult it was to grow and maintain. And it was now that Ingram started to think that he didn't just want to collect them anymore to boast to have this biggest collection in the world. He realized that he also wanted to save these trees that were in decline. He had grown such an attachment to them. He didn't want to see these varieties going extinct, especially in the country that loves them so much. And he did then write at the time that it may not be too late to save some types from oblivion. Collingwood did find himself in luck in regards to finding different varieties in Tokyo. He did find not his zeal, his other determination. In Tokyo, he did find his determination renewed with temples full of blossoms at the time. At the temple of Kiyomizu-dera, by the waterfall there, he found a tree that he did not have, based off a variety known as the Edo Higan type. And so while he was there, he asked for a cutting from the tree to be sent to his home. Later at the Kyoto Imperial Palace, he found one more new cherry tree, which was an unusual looking Yamazakura type. And later on in his time in Kyoto, he even found another 3 types that he didn't have from the Hirano shrine, these being Kikuzakura, Imose, and Taoyama type. Collingwood did, however, find himself confused by the cherry names here, a bit like he had in England. He found that people in Kyoto were saying Kyoto is the ancient capital city. There is no need to follow Tokyo customs. And so just like in England, he was finding that the same types of trees could have multiple different names depending on who was around, which again made it a bit difficult to figure out if he had them or not, but he did have more connections now to the cherry blossom enthusiast world. But by this point as well, he had studied for many years, so he was better at figuring it out on his own. It became more and more apparent then, as he was traveling around Japan for the final time, that most people didn't see the threat of losing the actual cherry blossoms. Everyone in Japan, it seemed, especially the government, thought that the ones disappearing from the cities, like I said, they would live on in the mountains, and so they didn't need to take any action. They would still be around, even though they might no longer be seen by people. But Collingwood did not believe that it would be safe for these trees and that they would likely not survive, especially when you consider a lot of the older breeds were more difficult to maintain, and they had been created by human hand. They weren't used to living in the wild, so there was a potential that they would not have survived without human intervention. Again, on his journeys, he went to visit the area of Yoshino, which was once actually known to have been a mecca for Japanese cherry blossoms. But when he arrived, he only found a thinly planted group of trees and scraggly specimens. Again, this was in part due to the new Meiji government at the time, due to their radical changes to the country, including changes to the religions of Japan. They had instigated things such as the separation of Shinto and Buddhism Act, but they had also now banned the religion of Shugendo, which was prevalent in this area. And due to the fact that this religion could no longer be as powerful as it once was, people weren't going there as much. People weren't maintaining the area, and so it had fallen into decline, which sadly had affected the cherry blossoms at the time. And so Collingwood sadly had to carry on from this area, and he went to meet a man who was said to be the head of all cherry blossom law. This man was known as Seisaku Funatsu, and he took Collingwood for a cherry viewing along the Arakawa River, which runs through Tokyo. The area at the time was well known to be the area of the 5 colored cherry trees of the Arakawa River. And at one time, it was said to have been a superbly beautiful place. But now, though some of the old beauty did remain, some of the trees there still bloom beautifully every year, but Collingwood found that due to new drainage works in the area, it had led to a lot of the cherry blossoms being cut down to make room for the works. And a lot of the cherry blossoms that remained were now greatly affected by the pollution, which was rapidly increasing in the modernizing city. And so Seisaku related to Collingwood how he had been trying to do what he could to help these trees. He had been replacing lost trees with saplings over time, but they had been stolen repeatedly until he got to the point where he could no longer carry on replacing these trees. I will say here briefly that you can still go visit the cherry blossoms there to this day. They are rather beautiful, but the book where I've drew most of my research from for this episode does say that the area now is a shadow of its former self. And so I think it would be very interesting to have seen how beautiful the area once was before Tokyo underwent such dramatic changes. But going back to the tale, luckily many of these blooms from here and the local area do now survive around the world due to Collingwood's help, but also due to the help of two other men known as Takagi Magoemon and Kengo Shimizu. Magoemon once collected specimens from the gardens of the daimyos that lived in Tokyo at the time. But when the daimyos had to leave and the new government came in, he found himself unable to do so. Most of their properties were now shut and locked up, and he couldn't access them. And so he took it upon himself, and praying for forgiveness to the gods he believed in, he began to climb the fences of these properties and take cuttings of the trees as he feared that they would soon be lost. And in a lucky turn of events, I suppose, even though we are talking about a flood, when the Arakawa area did flood, the local people then demanded that cherry blossoms be planted in the area so that their roots may hold the soil together in case of future flooding. And Kengo Shimizu at the time, who was the governor of the area of Arakawa, knew of Magoemon's collection. And so a lot of the species were replanted in the area due to their work and due to their interest in the cherry blossoms. So moving on from the Arakawa River, Collingwood now traveled onward to Nikko as he had planned, where he did find and collect seeds from a type of cherry known as the Sergeant cherry. And in a small village of Kamiyoshida, he uncovered a previously unknown cherry variety and eventually had cuttings of that tree also delivered to his home. And this tree, as it was previously unknown, he dubbed Asano, named after the samurai from the 47 Ronin. Overall, everything was looking good. Like Collingwood would not only expand his collection greatly now, but there was actually a chance that he could ensure the protection of these varieties from going extinct. And so it was time to tell the people in power in Japan that their cherry trees were dying. And though Collingwood may have been averse to giving a speech about it himself, he was asked by Aisaku Hayashi to do so. And this all finally happened in April of 1926. Reporters and photographers came to the talk, and 150 of Japan's most powerful came to listen to Collingwood. And though he spoke no Japanese, one of his cherry enthusiast friends did translate for him throughout. Collingwood then said the following: "Why is it that your flowering cherries often seem to do better in England than their native country? I would like to confess to a feeling of disappointment with regard to the size and condition of some of the trees growing in your parks and public places. Long before aesthetic Japan became contaminated by the hustle and bustle of Western races, your people produced an amazing number of varieties. In recent years, not only has there been no attempt whatsoever made to improve these varieties, but many of them are in serious danger of extinction. Were it not for enthusiasts, you may have permanently lost most varieties. I feel confident that in years to come, the Japanese will have to seek some of their best sorts in Europe and America." Collingwood then rounded off his speech by telling them of the trees in his own garden, which were no longer growing in Japan, and that he would reintroduce them to Japan no matter the cost. It was just that, as of right now, Collingwood wasn't sure how he was going to do this. Sadly, after presenting them with his thoughts, as well as all the facts, there was little, if no impact. The government had other priorities, getting the economy back on track. After all, this was after the 1923 Kanto earthquake, and they were still reeling from the fallout effects of that. And so, in their minds, saving a few trees when they still had so many other types of cherry blossoms still in Japan, it just didn't seem important to them in the slightest. And so Collingwood returned home, I suppose hoping that perhaps the government would do something, no matter how small it may have been. But failing that, he at least could still continue to protect the blossoms himself, even if the government of Japan wouldn't. And so finally, after many months, the cuttings he had asked for from the species he had seen in Japan finally arrived, and so he immediately got to work in having them grow in his garden. Some had sadly died on the long journey back to England, but fortunately a great many others had survived. The collection grew, and he soon found himself becoming the trading center for cherry blossoms, and his collection spread around the world, ensuring cherry blossoms thrived even more, though still not in Japan at this time. And finally, after all of this, after all of the effort to protect these trees, in the early 1930s, it was time to finally start sending these trees back to Japan. And that's where I want to stop for today. I feel like it was a lot of information. I feel like the episode is getting a bit long, and if I did the second half of the story, it would be far too long for people, and so I'm going to break this into a two-part episode. We haven't done that in quite a long time. What did you think, Heather, so far?
It's interesting. There's a few things you mentioned. First of all, the Yoshino cherry. Now, it's interesting, back when I was doing ALT, one of the things that one of my schools did was each year the students would make little plaques to put on the different trees around the school. And one of them was the Yoshino cherry. They had me write the little name plaque for that. So I remember that word Yoshino. I'm like, so even like at the schools, I'm assuming that most of the cherries there must be, at least at this school, was Yoshino cherry. So the practice of sharing plants across countries, like for example, I know back in when I lived in North Carolina, there was an arboretum there that had a lot of connections to like horticulturists in Japan, and they would pass plants back and forth. So I know at least in North Carolina, because of the similarities in climate to many places in Japan, a lot of different plants have been introduced into both countries, and there's like a partnership there. So a lot of plants are now in both countries, and even like an invasive species, for example, all along the south there is a plant called the kudzu vine that is, it's just, if you go out, you drive in the country, this spread of green leaves that take over everything. Found out recently those come from Japan, and the roots are actually used to make a starch for like different desserts and different things. So it's really interesting. I should have assumed it would have happened in England too, but not having grown up in England, I would not have the awareness like I had from, living in North
Yeah.
Carolina. So and also because there's different flowering trees, and those, like the apple you mentioned, there's the apricot. So I think the apricots actually start blooming first before the cherries. I think even here, I remember the apricots being the first ones to bloom. So, we kind of automatically think cherry trees in Japan, but I mean, really, there are cherry trees in lots of different places. But it's just really interesting that you think cherry tree, you think automatically, like, even I think Japan, although there are like the cherry trees in Washington, D.C., but they were a gift, I think, from Japan. So I think I mean, it's a really fascinating story, and it's quite beautiful that just a happen chance just caused him to switch over into a different field, and that happened to actually be able to have ties into saving so many different species of trees. And it was just a matter of chance. It wasn't intentional. It wasn't, I'm going to start studying cherries. I grew up studying cherries, or I studied it in college. It was there in his garden. So I loved that small little thing that just triggered such a huge, massive
Yeah.
change. And of course, we haven't got to the second part of the story, but I'm assuming since it said he saved the trees, we can go ahead and, not be worried that he did not save the trees. He saved several trees. So we know the second part of the story in some way.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing the rest of it.
Oh, I'm glad. I'm glad you liked it. But for us today, then, what do you have in your literary corner?
So you mentioned Hokusai, which was unintentionally throwing back. I'm just blatantly throwing back to last episode because you mentioned Senryū last
I
week,
did.
and I got very excited. I'm like, oh, we're doing that. That's happening. If we had planned it better, we probably should have done that with the Hokusai episode. But hindsight is 2020, I guess, and I have really bad vision. So anyway, you didn't realize that just by mentioning that Senryū and your Hokusai, that I was going to go into, I call it a glorious meandering of wonder that was going to take me far beyond Wikipedia and Google. And it would even take me into company-sponsored Senryū contests that give such gems as, loosely translated, comparing ages at the class reunion and toilet paper.
That's a very strange poetry topic, but okay.
Well, apparently you can buy toilet paper that has the top 20 Senryū written on the sheets each year for the low, low price of 350 yen per roll. So you can have Senryū toilet paper. You've got competitions. Oh, and also in my research, I found a manga called Senryū Girl about a girl who can only communicate in 575 syllables. And there's an anime about it too.
That would be a very difficult manga to write, surely. Like, every time this character speaks, they have to find a way for her to express what's needed in a 575 syllabary.
That's the next thing I'm going to have to go and look up is this manga to see how they do it, because I'm very intrigued. Yes, because you would have to sit there and just like count. I mean, I have to count on my fingers when I read. Anyway, I digress. So there's just so much information about Senryū. Well, let's start kind of a little bit at the beginning where the word comes from. Senryū comes from the name Karai Senryū, who lived from 1718 to 1790, and he was a tenja, or a judge of poetry competitions. He also published a poetry collection called the Yanagariru in 1765. Now, Senryū are haiku, but not all haiku are Senryū. Both share the 575 pattern, but the thing is with haiku, and there's a few more terminology that is associated with that, but I'm going to keep it very basic and simple for our first introduction. Haiku are generally serious poems that are written about nature that have the season words or kigo. Now, Senryū, on the other hand, are comic or humorous poems that rely on wordplay and wonderful, wonderful happy puns, and sometimes some rather adult humor. However, for this podcast, we're going to keep things on the more everyone approachable side. We'll leave that for another. Yeah, we'll leave that. Senryū are also many times composed by amateurs, and there are several Senryū contests that have been held throughout the years, such as the Daiichi Insurance Company Sarariman Senryū Konkuru, or the Office Workers Senryū Competition, where people can write in with their own Senryū and they get judged. And I think for this one, there's a cash prize. If there's not a cash prize with this one, there's another one that does have a cash prize. Now, I'm worried about the copyright restrictions because these websites are in Japanese, and I got them from a newspaper article, so I don't think I could read them. But if you want to read them along with their English translations, there are a couple links in my sources, and I definitely recommend it because they are quite brilliant. Oh, and there's also Senryū contest in English as well. Now, I'm going to do something a little different. I like to, shake things up sometimes. We're going to do quite a few literary corners on Senryū because it is a massive topic. I have just covered the bare basics right now. I'm going to start kind of at the end and work our way back. And so this is a very recent, very, very recent Senryū that is written by a very, very, very major amateur. And it's also written in English. I will have to say that I'm the amateur, and I am attempting to write a Senryū. Now, I did write one in Japanese, but I'm not confident enough yet to share that one, so I'll just start with English.
Well, I look forward to the Japanese one next week then.
That's a challenge. Okay. I'll keep thinking and maybe I'll write a better one. Now, this one is humorous because I'm actually poking a little bit of fun at myself. It's coming up on our 1-year anniversary for the podcast. And so we've started talking and reflecting on some of the things we've done for the past year. And something I've thought about is just the time of picking out poetry. And So yeah, this is kind of a little bit about making fun of myself, just a tiny bit about picking out poetry. So here we go. You don't need a pen or a pencil, Thomas, because you should be able to understand this one, I hope.
Okay.
Unless my English is really terrible, I apologize in advance for my English. See, it's more humorous. Okay. Look for a poem. Open 100 poems, but I choose special.
I definitely get it. I do remember when we first started this podcast, our default was the 100 Poets because it was one of the few books we had. I mean, I know the library has doubled in this last year. Like, it's ridiculous the amount of books we now
Maybe this
have.
past week.
Or even
this
just
past
this
week.
past week, I bought a lot more books. But yeah, we drew a lot upon the 100 Poets because it was a good starter for us to both learn from. And then, yeah, as soon as you found Basho, they all went out the window. You've kind of turned your back on them. So I like the poem. It fits the 575. It's tailor-made to not only you, but this podcast in general. So I think it's a poem well done.
Thank you so much. I don't think I'd win a contest, but as long as it makes you happy, then I feel like a big winner. and that's the funny thing is, this is the beauty of Senryū. Anybody can do it. I feel like, oh, do you remember the movie Ratatouille? So like anyone can cook.
Yeah.
Anyone can Senryū. Anyone can, and lots of people do. It's a really approachable form of poetry. And therefore, I really want to spend a little bit more time with this to learn it more, to become more acquainted. We will go back to several different types of poetry as well. And also, I have some songs I want to share. But that's where we're going to leave it today. It was just an very basic introduction to Senryū.
I'm kind of looking forward to how you're going to develop this over the next few weeks. Like normally we will, well, I would say you will jump to, not necessarily like you said, for me, the literature corner, it's about the poet. I like to know about the person behind it, but for you, it's about the poem. So you just find poems that you're interested in. But I like the idea of now for the next few weeks, you give us a bit more about Senryū every week and we hear more examples of Senryū. So it's more about the type of poem than the people for the next few weeks. I like that idea. So thank you for thinking of doing that.
You are so welcome. You just a little bit about Hokusai. Just took this. Thank you so much, Hokusai. We really appreciate you so very, very, very much beyond just your amazing artwork. Thank you for helping to inspire us for the form of poetry that you loved so well. We hope we do it justice. We will try our best.
I look forward to the poem next week, whether it be the one you wrote in Japanese or whether you do that and send you that other people have wrote. I'm looking forward to that for sure.
Actually, yeah, you mentioned that, Thomas, because also I would love for you to write a Senryū, either in English and Japanese someday. And anyone else listening, if you would like to attempt a Senryū in either English or Japanese, or even a language of your choice, we would love to hear it. And let us know if it's okay for us to read it on the podcast or a bonus episode, because that would be so much fun.
So I have my homework then, I suppose.
I'll give you a long due date. I mean, it's whenever you feel like it.
Okay.
So no due date.
All right. Well, thank you for all of that today. It was very enjoyable.
You're so welcome. And thank you so much. I'm so happy you got that book. And I just can't wait to read it when you're done with it. I'm first on the list next, just letting you know. I'm going to sign my name in the little card in your book.
We could have attempted to do it earlier with research online, but a lot of the starting points for research, like obviously when I start my research, Wikipedia is a good start because you see what they reference and then you go on from there. But the Wikipedia page for him was surprisingly small, considering the amount of stuff I've even done just today and everything I still have to say. So yeah, I wanted to wait till I had the book I've been using. I'll give you the name of the book next week when we finish it up. So book recommendation next week. But yeah, I'm glad we waited. I'm glad it took us a few more weeks, but we're finally getting there. But yeah, I suppose thank you again everyone for tuning in this week. We hope you enjoyed the story of the cherries and your first jump into Senryū. Yeah, I suppose there's no need for me to say what's next week. It's going to be part B of the cherries. And you already know what Heather will be doing. So I guess that's time for me to sign off then. What about you, Heather?
I will be right there with you signing off.
All right then, guys. Well, we will speak to you next week. Mata ne.
皆さん気をつけて。またね。
If you've enjoyed the Japan Archives, please consider checking out historyofjapan.co.uk, a database we are making on Japanese history. You can also find the show notes for all our episodes here. If you're on Instagram, you can follow my account over at nexus_travels, that's NEXUS_travels.
We also have a Facebook and Twitter page, which you can find at Japan Archives. If you're interested in little slices of life in Japan, be sure to check out my website over at heatheroveryonder.com. Thank you for tuning in today. We hope you enjoyed the episode. And if you have any suggestions for future episodes, have anything you'd love to hear about, head on over to historyofjapan.co.uk and send us a message.
If you enjoyed the show, please be sure to give us a rating and review over on iTunes. Thank you again for listening, guys. Until next time, bye.
Mata ne!